what you've touched upon is something that I found, as an educator coming from Scotland and coming to America, you do a lot of things wonderfully well, but I was overwhelmed by the amount of testing and quantifying when I came to America. And when I spent those 20 years in the schools, I wasn't doing anything different that a teacher couldn't do, except I was using stories that I loved and touched my heart. But how on earth can you quantify that? Where does it fit into the curriculum when you're feeding a heart?
School is in. But are you really ready to learn? Open your eyes to a new day in education with The Awakening Educator, a program specifically designed to explore a new, mindful way of educating our youth. Learn about social-emotional learning, new modalities of teaching, and the most relevant topics in education with your hosts, Susan Andrian and Megan Sweet. Susan and Megan will take you inside the issues by looking at them from different points of view, from policies and research to teaching models that are actually used in schools. There's never a dull moment in this classroom. Have any questions you'd like to ask? Maybe you have knowledge you'd like to share, and share your thoughts live on air. Grab a pen and paper and get ready to open your textbooks and minds to a new way of learning on The Awakening Educator.
Hello, welcome to The Awakening Educator. I'm Susan Andrian.
And I'm Megan Sweet.
And we are figuring this StreamYard out with and today I was playing we might get up slow, but we get up because I figure for many of us today is the last day of school.
That's right. It's the last day of school for your son and for lots of kids here. That's right. Not for mine. Haha.
So we are so excited today to have Kathleen Pelley from Ireland. Is that right, Megan?
Well, she's native of Ireland, but she's lived here in the United States for a long time. And I'm sure she'll be able to share her story too. But she was an educator and started doing storytelling and actually reading stories to youth. So that's what we'll be talking with her about today, the power of having someone read and tell you a story, especially for children. She's also an author herself. Hey, Shika. So it's, I'm really excited about this. It's something I used to do with my own students. So I'm excited to hear what Kathleen has to say.
So let's bring her on into the conversation.
Let's do it.
Let's do it. Hello, Kathleen.
Hello, everyone. Nice to be here. Thank you.
Welcome to The Awakening Educator. We are so excited to have you here today. First, maybe you could start by telling our audience a little bit about yourself.
Sure. Well, I don't mind being called a native of Ireland. I do have my Irish passport, but technically I was actually born in Scotland, or as one little wise kindergartner once dubbed it, Harry Potter land. So I grew up in Scotland with an Irish dad, and I came to America some years ago with my husband and two girls. I studied history. I always loved stories. My dad was an Irishman, of course, so I grew up with that lovely Celtic love of stories. My dad would tell me stories about the fairies and the wee people, and anybody who's Celtic knows that they love their stories. So I fell in love with stories I tell children before I could read or write, because I listened to them on the BBC Children's Story Hour. And that was where I fell in love with the music of our language and with the way words can paint pictures in your mind. And then fast forward decades later, no wonder I wanted to write picture books. And then here I am with my podcast, kind of doing the BBC Children's Story Hour. I studied history at university, became an elementary school teacher. I loved doing drama. I loved doing storytelling with my kids. Came to America, was a substitute teacher for a little while. But then I really got to do the best of both worlds, because I went into school for 20 years and I read them fairy tales and folk tales from around the world. When that little school closed some years back, a friend of mine said, why don't we do it online? That was long before podcasts. So I used to do little read alouds on my website. And then about 3 years ago, one of my daughters said, we have to do a podcast. And so I get to do what I love most of all. I do fairy tales and folk tales from around the world, and I do them on my podcast every week.
Well, thank you for that introduction. I got a chance to listen to one of your stories today. I spent some time listening to The Giant, and I just thought it was just so beautiful the way that the emotion and the character and the way you brought that the story so alive. And, I've always read with my children and I'm in elementary schools, and read out louds are such an important part of creativity and imagination and learning. And so we're really excited to have you here today to kind of talk about the way you weave through the creativity and also just the stories, the lessons that seem to be a big part of the stories that you have on your podcast and your show.
When we were preparing for this show, you and I were talking about the fact that I used to read stories to my students too. And I'm a history teacher as well, or by training. And I taught middle school for a long time and for 10 years. And my favorite teacher, who taught 6th grade, he would still read to us. And those are my most treasured memories of that teacher. And he was a great teacher. We did a lot of things, but there was something so nurturing about coming in after lunch. He would read to us and just watch the emotions on his face and have how the stories came alive. I can still see him now, all these years later, doing that. And so when I became a teacher, that's what I wanted to do as well. And I've always read to my students. So all the way up through 8th grade, little salty 8th graders love to be read to, just like little ones do. But I think I shared this with you, but one of the places where reading stories was a core part of my teaching was when I taught in a school that served students who were diagnosed with severe emotional disturbances of some kind or another. Sometimes that was the only thing that I could do to keep the group focused and calm during the day. And there were times when I would read for sometimes a couple hours at a time. We read so I'd start to get longer books. Like we read The Never Ending Story, and it probably went pretty quick because of the amount of time. But and it led to us then starting to create our own stories. Then we started to write our own stories together. And I share all that background just to say that as somebody who's benefited from the stories and who's seen them myself, I've seen why storytelling is so important. I'm just wondering if, you've had 20 years of coming into the classroom. Can you share some of the anecdotes you have of why reading a story aloud to a child versus having them sit and read by themselves, two different important things, but what is the magic of the read aloud to you?
Well, I've actually got one story. It's almost hard to relate to it. Even 15 years later, I find it a very touching story. So first of all, before I do that, what you've touched upon is something that I found, as an educator coming from Scotland and coming to America, you do a lot of things wonderfully well, but I was overwhelmed by the amount of testing and quantifying when I came to America. Mm-hmm. And when I spent those 20 years in the schools, I wasn't doing anything different that a teacher couldn't do, except I was using stories that I loved and touched my heart. But how on earth can you quantify that? Where does it fit into the curriculum when you're feeding a heart? And yet it's the most important thing. So let me tell you this story that I do relate quite a lot when I do teachers' workshops. To me, stories are a lot like good lives. They share many things in common. And one of the things that good lives and good stories, I think, give is this hope. There's a fabulous storyteller called John Shea, and he says, one tells a story not to educate or indoctrinate, but to illuminate, to enchant the reader into the world of the story, so that when they emerge, they do so with an enhanced view of the possibilities of their life, ergo hope. So here's my story. It was around the end of the year. It was May, and it was a 3rd grade class. And actually, I was doing a Junior Great Books Foundation leader course. And so I'm sure many of your listeners are aware of that, where you read a classic story and then you enter into a shared inquiry discussion. And why it was so good with these children was many of them did come from low-income, struggling readers, but they didn't have to read, because I read the story aloud. So it was a 3rd grade class. There was one child in the class all year long I'd noticed. First, somewhat androgynous. I learned she was a little girl. She was the tallest. She was the smallest, most frail child in the class, just a wee wisp of a girl. And I found out from her teacher that her mother had been a crack addict, but she was very lovingly adopted into a happy home. But the effects of this was she was the smallest in the class, hadn't uttered a word all year long. So we read Lion and Mouse, the beautiful Aesop classic about the mouse that's captured by the lion and begs to go free in the hopes that one day he can help the lion. And of course, the lion laughs, but lets the mouse go free. Years later, the lion is in the hunter's net, and along comes the little mouse to save him. So I read the story, and as I often did, I said to the children, I wonder, what will you take away in your heart from this story? Whereupon this little girl, who hadn't said a word all year long, knelt up on her chair. She made herself as tall as the classmates, and her little chin wobbled as she spoke in a loud, proud voice and said, small people can do great things. Whereupon tears sprang to my eyes, because I thought, oh, there's Aesop's words slicing through time into the heart of this little girl at a low-income school, making her believe in her own inner greatness. Mm-hmm. That's what reading aloud to stories does, because beyond measure, it is feeding children's hearts. And especially when teachers or parents are choosing stories that touch their heart. So when I go to family literacy nights and I talk to parents, and they mean so well and they want to give a love of reading to their children, and I always say to them, your job is not to teach your children to read. That's the teacher's job. Your job is to teach children to love stories. And the first way you're going to do that is to find a story you love that touches your heart and share it with them. I'm sure you're all aware of Mem Fox's fabulous book, Reading Magic. And in it, she says, reading aloud cures pretty much everything from warts to global warming. And a lot of skeptics think, that's rather an airy-fairy claim, but it's not. If you understand that J.K. Rowling used this quote at the end of her Harvard address. I don't know if you know that, but years ago, Harvard invited J.K. Rowling, a storyteller, to give the commencement speech. And she ended with a quote by Seneca, as is a tale, so is life. Not how long it is, how good it is what matters. And so that's why Mem Fox's claim makes sense to me. When you feed children good stories, you're feeding their heart with goodness. And they don't get that in other places in the curriculum or at home in the same way as with a story.
Oh, that's just, I got shivers multiple times while you were talking. I said this to you when we were talking before the show as well, that I could listen to you all day, but also your passion for the power of storytelling is so clear and comes across so well. And I love that story of the little girl who found herself and found her might in the midst of a story like that. Yes. And I love that so much. Yeah. And
there's a couple of things too, as you were saying, as I'm a mental health person and work with children. I'm a marriage and family therapist, and mostly have been clinically, all my clients have been children and adolescents, and the use of stories as healing. And that story that you just shared with us around this little girl seeing herself in the mouse and seeing what's possible and being able to kind of puff her chest up and do that is really a key way in which beautiful storytelling can be an opportunity for healing and growth for all kinds of things. So I loved that story. And I was able to think back to so many moments in therapy with children where the right book touched the right child at the right moment.
Absolutely. Yes. And, a couple of my own books are published with the Child Welfare League of America. And so a couple of times I've gone to their conferences and I've given a little talk, and many of the people that they minister to are obviously families at risk, and also the social workers who go out and help. And so one of the talks that I did was kind of addressing what you've just talked about, Susan, was what I call book balm, that you should always have a little bag of books in the car somewhere. And as you also said, it's the particular book with the particular child at the right time. There's so many books out there, but you just don't know the particular hurt in their heart that some particular story might touch and soothe. Another thing I say to children was, after I left Edinburgh University with my degree in history, I didn't remember all the battles and the dates, but I remembered the stories of all those people at Bonnie Prince Charlie and Mary Queen of Scots. And one such character, of course, was Florence Nightingale and the Lady of the Lamp. And so I decided I would go off to become a nurse, a children's nurse. And it was a brief and disastrous dalliance because I loved children. But I didn't like seeing them being sick.
Yeah.
But years later, I'll say to children, I think of myself as a kind of a nurse because stories can heal the hurts in your heart.
Mm-hmm.
And this past year, I think I maybe mentioned this to you, Megan, already when we talked. I mean, what a year. And, in a way, it was very humbling because my podcast seemed to take off in the middle or in the beginning of the pandemic, rather, for many people at home. And I'd get some very touching notes from parents talking about, they couldn't maybe even articulate it so much other than to say their child loved the story. It wasn't about me, but they loved the stories because it helped to ground them. It gave them some comfort. And during that time, I would always end my podcasts with one of my favorite quotes by a mystic, but also a poet who said, all shall be well, and all manner of things shall be well. And, you could say that's sort of the Pollyanna way of looking at life, but I'm a storyteller. So I like to think that it addresses what all good stories tell us, that in the end, despite the madness and the sadness, good will triumph. And so I think stories can give children a glimmer again of that goodness that simmers under the sadnesses of our lives.
I just love that. I love that you keep mentioning that it's feeding our hearts, which you're right, especially I think in the United States, our focus and attention on, and you quantify it, the number of times I've had to bang my head against the wall. Actually, we're in the middle of plan creation time right now, and I'm supporting 2 school districts. And that's the challenge of how do we quantify this thing that's so important? I'm seeing a question, but I want to answer mine. I got distracted. I have to learn how to deal with the quotes when the questions when they're coming up, Susan. I lost what I was going to say. Oh, well, feeding the heart is really where I was going. And part of what I was thinking about when you were talking is that I think read stories are really important, but I'm wondering what you think about, a lot of cultures, they have a narrative that is a part of their culture. And you actually named that with your own father, that storytelling is a part of a lot of cultures. And so I think even if you're not a good reader and you can't read magically, because I think a lot of people don't want to read to their kids because it doesn't sound like you or others when they're reading, right? And they're this is how I feel about singing. So you feel very self-conscious about it. But I think actually just the power of any story is important, and making that connection, and the stories of your family and the stories of your history and the stories of your culture. And I'm just wondering your thoughts about that.
Absolutely. When I go to family literacy nights again, many of the parents are maybe Hispanic, they are from countries in Africa, and there they are in the evening coming out to find out about, literacy. And I'll always say exactly what you said, Megan. I say, it doesn't matter. You don't need to be reading to them in English. Tell them a story from your own culture. The point is to get them to nurture a love of stories. It doesn't matter. I totally agree with you. All the more so if you feel at all nervous, then do something that you're not nervous about. Tell them how you came to this country or whatever it is in your background, a favourite story. And I think parents, some of them, I could see a look of relief passing over their faces. Like, no, you don't need to read an English storybook. No, get them one from your own culture. That's okay. I think that's totally.
Yeah, that the point is just the love of stories and the love of understanding life through stories. I just think is so powerful. Yeah. Thank you for that.
Yeah. It's hard to believe, but we are up at our first commercial break.
Oh,
yeah.
Goodness. Okay.
It came really fast. So we'll take a quick break.
Hey listeners, are you enjoying this show? And do you want to hear more? Then please subscribe to our show on your favorite streaming platform. Like this show and tell others about us. We're available on CastBox, Deezer, Podcast Addict, Podchaser, Google Podcasts, iHeartRadio, Spotify, Spreaker, and Apple Podcasts. So please connect with us there. You also can watch shows live being recorded on our Facebook site, The Awakening Educator. You can connect with us via Instagram or Twitter at The Awakening Educator. And you can also subscribe to our newsletter. We've been busy recording a ton of terrific shows that will be rolling out over the rest of this year. So we would love to be able to have you be a regular member of our community. Thank you so much and have a great, great day.
And we are back. Before we went out on break, and it was such a beautiful way to end that section of the conversation. We do have a question from Facebook asking about how stories help. So it's perhaps this allows them to relate and understand that they're not alone in the position. So really giving kids the experience of connecting with other people around an experience that's more challenging or difficult or sad or scary or whatever it might be. And so how do you use your stories and the reading out loud to really connect people to people or children to children?
Yeah, I don't think consciously about that because I think it is an automatic. I think stories do connect us. They connect us to those who have gone before us. They connect us around the world. I try and use folk tales from all around the world. I think we've got countries from over about 150 countries. So I suppose what I'm saying is I don't think of it consciously. I just know that stories do connect us. Mm-hmm. And they also connect us to those who will come after us. I mean, everything about a story is about connection. If you think about the story circle, we tell the stories in the circle. And of course, I'm a great lover of St. Patrick because he taught through stories. And like me, many people don't know, but St. Patrick was actually born in Scotland and he was kidnapped by pirates and taken to Ireland. And so he was homesick, as I have been a lot of my life. And he taught people through stories. And he took the ancient Celtic love of a circle, the sun and the moon that they worshipped, and put it around the Christian cross, and it became the Celtic cross. And I'm telling you all that because stories in themselves are about connection. Oftentimes the end will connect back to the beginning. So trying to answer your
yeah, I'm also what I'm thinking as you were talking, when we start to hear stories from all over the world and narrative from all over the world, there's these common themes. And I imagine that whether we're hearing a story from Africa or a Celtic story from Ireland or the stories of indigenous cultures around the world, that there's often these common themes of strength and warrior.
Exactly. It's what I like to call a universal truth. It's like long ago they taught what's the message or what's the lesson. And yes, but really to me, it's a universal truth. And I think this is not going off subject. There's so much emphasis nowadays in the publishing world, and I'm sure in education, and rightly so, on children having seen books that are both mirrors and windows, right? So the story has got to let them see others in the world that are different. But it's also got to reflect who they am. But two things about that is I think we should not lose touch with why we're doing that. And we're doing that because, yes, all these people in these different countries are different, but look at how we're the same. And we go back to this heart again. We all want goodness. We are connected by goodness. We're connected by stories. We all want the same thing. We all love the things for our children. We want to connect, we want goodness for our children. And so I like to emphasize that with teachers and parents when I talk about that whole thing of mirrors and windows. Don't lose sight of the fact that, yes, we're different, but don't focus on the differences. Focus on what brings us all together, that our human heart.
That's really powerful. And I mean, as you're saying that, one of the things that comes up for me that I know is one of the reasons why there's a focus on multicultural books is because often actually they're not written by people whose stories they are from the cultures that they're in, or they're creating stories that are telling one narrative and actually aren't showing that common connection. So I love that that's what you're naming across, because often, a story is written that only tells one part of a culture's background, say in the United States. Often, they don't always depict the full life of African-American children and families.
Sure.
More and more so they are, but a lot of times it's not true.
It's a tricky fine line, because for me, it makes a mockery of literature if you say, well, you can't write that story because you're a woman and I'm writing about a little boy.
Right.
My most recent book, it's not out yet, it's a Christmas book, so it's got slightly spiritual, I would say, overtones, but it's called Jesus, Mary and Joseph. So the little boy in the story is Hispanic. And a number of editors said to me, but you're not Hispanic. I thought, well, no, I'm not. But I know what it means to be other, to come from another culture. And my other point was, well, I'm not a 7-year-old boy either. Does that mean to say that any writer can't write about being a woman. Or to me, the whole point about literature is to be able to step into somebody else's shoes and look at the world through another's eyes. But I take your point completely, Megan, too, that you have to be very authentic when you're portraying cultures. You can't just, actually, not to sort of be frivolous, but years ago it used to be that you'd have a lot of these Irish stories, and I'd look and say, oh, that's an American person, that's my story. Uh-huh. So I can kind of see, there's a fine line there, isn't it? It's a balance of how you work with that.
Well, I think you bring up a really important and complex conversation, and I have this conversation with my husband, who's a writer. He's a screenwriter, so he tells stories all the time, and we have these conversations about whose story is it okay for him to tell, and what role are they playing in the overall arc of the story. And so it's this really interesting, and I think, as you said, complex situation where we want to make sure that folks are represented properly. We also want to make sure that writers of color and writers of other cultures have a place at the table, and that their stories are being told, and that they are getting a place where in the discourse and in the landscape where they haven't historically. And at the same time, when an individual writer is sitting down with their story, who are the characters that they're bringing to life, and where's the line? And I think when we get into the thinking that's binary, that's either this or that, I think there's so much problematic thinking when we're like, you can't, or you can, or you're right or you're wrong, rather than we need to start untangling the complexities of stories and narrative, and the importance of being able to engage in complex, rich, culturally connecting stories.
That's a very powerful insight that you had there, Susan. That helps me too, because that is the other layer of stories, is they're not black and white, literally, that you end up, oftentimes, I can't think of an example now, but recently when I'm reading a story, at the end of it, I'll say to the children, like, what's the story, souvenir? And I'll talk about that in a minute. But then I'll say to them, well, what do you think? The classic one, Jack and the Beanstalk. Was Jack a thief? Or was he a hero? And I love what you've just said there, because that is so rich in stories, the layers of meaning that you get, where a child has to link it to life and think, well, it's not just binary, it's not either or. Seldom is anything worth talking about either or. There's got to be more to it. And that's really important for children to see that in stories.
Well, I think you're just ready to get to it. And I appreciate your point there too, Kathleen, that it's complicated. And I think for me, it's making sure you're doing your homework. So, where I go in my mind always is, there was a book that depicted a Japanese American child, and he was wearing, like a classic Japanese jacket, maybe you could call a gi or something else, which is a shirt, but they had it crossed the wrong way. And in Japanese culture, the way that they had it crossed, you only do that when the person's died. And so it's really the matter of which way the layering of the shirt is. And it's a big cultural taboo to have it the wrong way, right? It's a big sign that you're not on track.
Yes.
And so this story, they had the shirt the whole time was the wrong way. So that would be an example of you're not doing your homework, and and I think fits into that cultural appropriation area that's dangerous and that we need to pay attention to. And yet there's a lot of magic that can come when we're learning about other cultures, or we're telling stories where there's multiple cultures that are represented in one story. And I know that that's what you and your husband often talk about too, is what's the intersection between all these different cultures and experiences. And you can't do that without including all the other cultures in the stories. So I appreciate that. You were just going to say that you talked about a souvenir, and I love that question. But I think part of what I'm also hearing from you, and you've shared it multiple times now throughout our discussion, is not only do you read the story to the children in a very beautiful and magical way, but then you're clearly having powerful conversations with the students afterward. They're helping them to think about what they just heard. And so I'd love to hear a little bit more about how you process stories, and maybe some guidance for parents who will, maybe they'll sit down and read the story and then they're like, okay, that was great, goodbye. But like, how can parents also connect in that kind of inquiry to the stories?
And again, it's a balance, isn't it? When I worked at the school for 20 years, I tried to make a point of not asking too much, just to let them sit with the story so that they didn't have to think, oh, I've got, it's just a pause to ponder in life and nothing's expected of them. That said,
right.
Maybe this is a good place to tell you why I call my podcast Journey with Story, because for years, the books that I have published when I go to schools and do a presentation, I always call it Journey with Story. And I take whatever book it is I've written and I show the children how this is like a story. And the first way it's like a story is that, or like a journey rather, it's how story is like a journey. When we go on a journey, we take a suitcase with us. And then I'll say, well, my story suitcase, and so is yours, is guess what? It's your heart, because the color of your thought dyes your soul. The color of your soul dyes your world. And so I show them all the things that I've loved that crept into that story. For example, The Giant King is about kindness and giants. And I've always loved giants as a little girl. And I've always loved the notion that you can change people with kindness. So that's one way that story is like a journey. The second way is it's about discovery. And again, this goes back to stories, writing. The creative process has not got just to do with your head. It's to do with your head and your heart and your soul, and you cannot separate them. And every time I write a book, I always discover something afterwards, because that creative act comes from something beyond me. Michelangelo said, I only discovered what was hiding there, when he talks about his sculptures. And I use that in The Giant King, where the little wood carver discovers the giant's goodness. He said, I only discovered what was hiding there. So I tell children that they can discover stuff about themselves when they write, because writing is coming from something beyond you, especially when you're writing in pencil and you're writing very fast. And then you look back at your writing and you go, oh, where did that come from? Something beyond me. The great artists and creators know that, whether you like to call it the great divine or whatever it is, it's something beyond us. And the third way that story and journey are alike is that when we come back from a journey, we take a souvenir, and let's tell the children it's a French word, to remember, to remind us of our trip. And when we finish with a story, whether we've listened to it or read it, we won't remember every word of it, but hopefully there will be a souvenir. And I'll say to children, the souvenir is that little glimmer of truth, even though it's a fictional story. There's a universal truth in that about what it means to be human, about what it means to live in this life. And so I don't do it every time, but I encourage parents at the end to think, or I'll say it at the end of my podcast, what was the story souvenir, do you think? And give them a little practice. And then I might tell them, or I'll say, but it could be this, or it could be that, you know. And I suppose it's another way of talking about a story's lesson or a moral, but I don't like using those terms. They seem sort of very didactic. They're not enchanting, you know. The story souvenir is much more enchanting. What will it? And there's no right or wrong answer. It's like, what is the glimmer in your heart? And your other question, Megan, I mean, we've had a podcast now for about 3 years, and I would love to have the resources, both time and finance, to be able to add a little bit each week for suggestions for follow. I mean, the teacher and me can't help that. But I don't have the, what's it they call it, the bandwidth yet to do that, but I hope that I will. And not too much, not just some general guidelines. I do get notes back from parents, and I love to hear this, and they'll say things like, oh, our little girls have memorized certain of your stories in the podcast and they act them out. I think, yes, that's what we want to do. Role playing. I remember doing that. And they memorize it. I love that. And again, I say that to parents and teachers. Learn poems by heart, even if it's just little snippets, because again, you're storing it away in your subconscious, you're storing it away in your heart, and it helps your writing and it helps your life, you know, to have that little poem that can be a little balm for your soul.
Yeah. There is something about memorizing that feels so where you feel it in your body, and you sort of sit in, you embody that poem. Exactly. And I think when you have the memorization, it's really Megan, you were going to say something there.
I just again, I'm appreciating the reminder that we can actually just enjoy something without having a point of it. So I appreciate you reminding us about that. I'm a very everything has a purpose kind of person.
Sure.
I think having that enchantment and being reminded of just being enchanted is really powerful. And you were talking earlier, it's actually one of the things I've been desperately looking for over the pandemic, and I haven't been able to find, but which is a story just to take me away. and to show me somewhere different. And, you know, I started teaching when Harry Potter came out. So I was a young teacher when Harry Potter came out. I wasn't a brand new teacher, but I was young. And so my whole teaching career has been marked by Harry Potter, the impact that those novels have had on children. And I love them. And then I started listening to them. You know, Jim Dale does an amazing job reading all the Harry Potter novels. And I listened to them for years just myself. It's still my comfort thing to listen to. And then my son and I would listen to them with my dad, and my dad was 60 something and I was in my 30s, and we would drive in the car and we would listen to Harry Potter together, and my son listens to it. And so I guess for me, I'm just relating back to, like, there is this power of just going to a different place that it can be magical or different. And you learn lessons. I mean, we talk about the lessons too, because they sometimes come up just naturally around Neville, for example, and his transformation over the years, and who he is and how he finds his voice and his strength and overcomes challenges. And each person and each story has those things. I relate to Harry Potter because it's just so magical for me. But I just love that notion of, you know, something that you said, that, you know, what's in your head colors your heart, and what's in your heart colors your soul, and that colors your world. And it's so true. And that focus on enchantment is so powerful. And just what we need. So I'm not at all surprised the families found their way to your podcast, especially during the pandemic, but before as well.
But let me just say, because I love J.K. Rowling. How could I not? She, you know, enchanted a generation of boys to read. But as an author, I was, first of all, madly jealous of her. And secondly, she changed the publishing business as regards picture books, because about that time, you know, my picture books were coming out and my editors were saying these are far too long. Because what happened was, and I'm sure you know this as educators, and I was sort of putting my picture book author hat on and being kind of mad at J.K. Rowling, but not really. There's these 7-year-olds that thought they were too old for story picture books. Because when I used to read picture books at the school that I went to, they weren't picture books for 500 words. They were like 1,500, like, you know, Roald Dahl, the enormous crocodile. And they were very sophisticated language, and they were folk tales for older children. But that kind of went out the window, sort of, with Harry Potter.
No. It's interesting, because as you're saying it, I'm like, I've never made that connection. But I know that the picture books of my childhood of the 70s had longer text and had a lot more depth to them. And it's
changed completely. Yeah. And another thing about it that's changed that makes my heart ache, and why I love the podcast, I would have editors that say, oh, you know, the child won't know the meaning of that word. Yes, and your point is, I mean, look at Beatrix Potter. She uses the word like superfluous. She uses the word like, sustenance, and, you know, these long, soporific, the effect of eating too much lettuce is soporific. Those are stories for 3-year-olds. Well, you know, what has happened, it's not for the child to read aloud. That's why I love reading stories aloud. The child is just listening, and as you know, the vocabulary, they can take in so much more, and they'll get to understand it in context, and it makes this for lush lyrical language. And then one more thing, I could go on and on about this, but you've touched so many things that I love to talk about. When you talk about enchantment in Harry Potter, you do know that J.K. Rowling got a lot of her influence, or her inspired by C.S. Lewis and the Narnia books. And when that was the first book I was given. I was about 9. You didn't have books in our house. We went to the library. We couldn't afford to buy books, but went to the library. We had a huge reading family, but at the library. So my uncle gave me this book. So this was my book. And I put it aside, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, because I wanted to read about a lion and a witch, but not a wardrobe, because that was just a very natural thing. And then one rainy Saturday, I must have succumbed. And of course, I opened up this book, and I fell in love with Narnia, and with the animals that talked, and the trees that walked, and how 4 children could save the world. And years later, I thought, oh, we need the ordinary wardrobe to get to the extraordinary. We need the lily platform to get to the wonder of Harry Potter land. And so the beauty of those kind of stories, and what J.K. Rowling does so well, and C.S. Lewis did it too, it's the ordinary that transports us to the extraordinary, and we're left with this hope and this belief that somewhere beneath the ordinariness of our life, there is an enchantment, there is a mystique that cannot be measured and cannot be understood and cannot be quantified. And I really admire J.K. Rowling, even though I'm jealous of her for doing that. It's just wonderful. And C.S. Lewis himself talks in a book. Kathleen Patterson has written a whole book about wonder and enchantment. And she talks about the three kinds of wonder, which is so countercultural in our world today, of course. The wonder of not knowing in the age of Google. There's actually things that we don't know, and it's okay to tell children that. And then there's the wonder of nature. And C.S. Lewis talks about reading Beatrix Potter, Squirrel Nutkin, and how he fell in love so much with that he wanted to possess autumn. It was this, autumn was a thing. And I remember feeling that about Narnia. It's like, you want to possess it. And that's the wonder behind and beyond the story that ties us to the meaning of our lives. And that, I mean, all of that in stories, and yet in our school curriculum, there's nothing that can quantify the importance of reading aloud to children, uninterrupted, without any other noise, and showing the children that this is sacred, special time stories.
I love that.
Well, we're up on our next break. We're just cruising through, and I'm glad that we're ending on wonder. Wonder, along with grace, has been just really central to me the last year, and it made me think really of Valerie Kerr's book, The See No Stranger, because she really talks about how wonder is what brings us back to love. And so, that quote that she has, that grief is the cost of love. Joy is the gift of love. Anger is what protects love, but wonder is what brings us back to love over and over again. And whenever we need to rethink how to come back to our love, we have to fall to wonder. So I'm glad we're ending this section on that, because it just touches my heart in such a deep way.
Yeah.
I'm wondering, when we come back, I want to put you on the spot a little bit, but I'm wondering if you could read a bit of one of your stories to us when you come back. Would you be willing to do that?
Sure.
Okay. We'll give an extended break so you can find a story.
Okay.
Yeah. Are you ready to change the way we do school? Yeah, me too. This is Megan Sweet from The Awakening Educator, and I've designed programming that empowers educators to reimagine how they approach their work. The pandemic has laid bare what most of us already knew. Our schools are under-resourced, our system is set up to fail our most vulnerable students, our educators are burned out and overwhelmed, and we all deserve better. With almost 30 years in education and 15 dedicated to leading school reform, I have been there and I get it. I've sat in the same seats that many of you have. I've been a classroom teacher and a school administrator. I've led district, county, and statewide reforms. I've coached dozens of teachers, principals, and executive leaders, and I've partnered with students, parents, and community activists. I have the scars from a lifetime of scrapping out in education, but also the lived experience that change is possible. After facing the prospect of quitting education myself, I began a journey to understand how I could stay in the profession I love, but do it in a way that was sustainable. Here's what I now know. It begins with self-care. Prioritizing ourselves can feel counterintuitive for educators, but when we give without attending to our own needs, eventually we run out of resources and burnout ensues. But when we stop fighting the system and instead look inward for the answers we seek, we live more empowered lives and are better able to create the educational settings where our students will thrive. Here's what I also know. We already have the answers inside of us, we just sometimes need help getting them out. And that's where I come in. I love supporting educators to find their inner voice and match all those school smarts with their innate instincts about what works best for students. My superpowers are listening well, synthesizing ideas, and breaking complex processes into understandable and accessible parts. How will we do it? It all starts with doing what I call self-work, dedicating time and attention to building a relationship with ourselves. We do this in a course I call the Beliefs Lab. By the end of this course, you'll understand why self-care is essential for being an effective educator, and you'll have strategies you can use right now. You will also get a handle on some of those beliefs that are helping you and those that are getting in the way. The next step is doing the schoolwork, leading classroom and school change. In the course I call The Cycle, you will learn a process for realizing goals for yourself and for your educational context simultaneously. You will also have deeper insights and strategies for putting your plans into action. Want more support as you engage in this self-work and schoolwork? I've got you covered. My personalized coaching and consulting services are designed to meet you in your school right where you are and support you to clarify your vision for the future. Want to know even more about what I do? My book is a great place to start. An Educator's Guide for Using Your 3 Eyes details the self-work and schoolwork that I described above and talks about concrete ways that you can start to feel better right now. If you want to learn more about how to work with me in the courses I just described, please come to my website, www.your3eyes.com. That's YOUR3EYES.com. I can't wait to support you to realize a better future for yourself and for your school community.
Welcome back. This is The Awakening Educator, and I'm Susan Andrian.
And I'm Megan Sweet, and we're having a truly wondrous conversation with Kathleen Pelley. I'm just having such a wonderful time. I don't want to actually even talk. I just want to keep listening.
I know. I just love her voice. You can hear the storytelling in her voice.
Well, you put me in quite a quandary because how can I choose? But I have taken this one, Raj the Bookstore Tiger, and I believe it's also on my podcast. It's part of my stories. So I'm just going to read you one little part of it.
Okay.
To give you a little heads up, I got the idea for this story from a picture of a cat looking in a mirror and seeing the face of a lion. And of course, mine morphed into a little cat who sees himself as a tiger. And I use that at schools too, to tell children, when you look in a mirror, you see your skin and your hair and your eyes, but you don't see your inner tiger or your inner lion, and you're much more than that. So it begins with Raj, who thinks he's a bookstore tiger, and he thinks he's a tiger because everyone tells him he's a tiger, until one day along comes a cat called Snowball, who tells him, you're not a real tiger, you're just a joke tiger. And so poor little Raj is devastated, and he doesn't come down for story time anymore, and he just sits huddled up on a shelf. His owner is the bookstore owner, Felicity Fotheringham. So one night, as Raj hid beneath Felicity's chair, he heard her reading aloud from a book. Tiger, tiger, burning bright in the forests of the night, she said. Raj poked his head out and peered at Felicity. Yes, Raj, she whispered. Isn't this a splendid poem by Mr. Blake? I knew you'd like it. Slowly, Raj crawled up into Felicity's lap. He sat there purring loudly all evening as she read the poem to him again and again. In the morning, Raj greeted Felicity with his best tiger roar, followed by pretend ambush and some dust mote swatting. Why, Raj, my little tiger, cooed Felicity. I believe you're back to your old self. Wait till you see what I've got planned for you today. And off they went to open the bookstore. By the time Snowball arrived, Raj was basking in the window. Move over, Sonny, ordered Snowball. No room for joke tigers here. But Snowball's jibes had lost their sting. Raj didn't budge, not even when Snowball hissed and scoffed.
There's something magical about how you bring the story to life. And I, like Megan, my kids are teenagers now, so I don't think they're going to listen to it with me. But they might, or they might listen on their own. And it makes me think of just how you bring a story to life, right? So what is it that goes into the way you embody that reading of the story and those characters?
Well, I mean, I feel as if I'm harping on about this, the love and the heart and everything. But that is really what it is. I mean, sometimes when I worked at the school for 20 years, I maybe had a friend or maybe even some of the teachers who'd have a book that they liked because it taught a particular lesson or something, and they would ask me to read it. And I'd have to very politely and gently say no. If I don't love the language and I love the way, That having said that, on my podcast, obviously I have to have public domain stories. So, there might be the Brothers Grimm, or there might be an old folk tale, and the language is somewhat old fashioned. And I don't have too much time, but I'll usually adapt it a bit so that I like the flow of the language. So I think the first thing is I love language. I love the sound of it. To me, it should be music. I mean, I don't write poetry, but I read a lot of poetry, and it's hard to explain or to teach it to people because I feel as if it's something that has to come from your own self. It's like you can't give somebody certain things. They have to feel it in their heart. And it's from a lived experience, if I'm kind of rambling here a little bit, but
I love that you say no sometimes. I mean, that's something that's hard for me anyway, saying no. I'm getting better at it. But that idea of that it has to resonate for you.
Exactly. And I don't know if everybody feels that strongly, but maybe because I was raised listening to stories, and sound is very important to me. A person's voice and the timbre and the way it sounds. There's a musicality, there's a beauty, and almost it's like a person's soul comes out within their voice too. And so, in answer to your question, but I think any parent can do that if they love the story. I mean, Mem Fox, her website, gives people lots of tips about reading aloud, and it always goes back to joy and fun and beautiful language. I think that's the other thing, is not to skimp on beautiful language. And there's so many books out there, and there's so many stories that I'll say to teachers and parents, if you can, take the time to find the story that resonates with you, that you love. I mean, I remember when my girls were young that occasionally they'd have a book that I hated it, so I would hide it, which is terrible. I didn't want to read it. You know how a child will just get a fixation on a certain book or something. So all I can say is I think that it goes, for me, it's just second nature. It has to be something that I love, and I get excited about telling the story.
Well, I think that's great advice for anybody who wants to bring stories to their own children or into their classroom, is to really start with a story that you love and care about. And when I go back to my 6th grade teacher, he certainly was not at all as lovely to listen to as you were at all. And he would do these funny, he would try and do like a girl's voice, and it sounded very silly and cracked. But what came through, and what I'm still remembering more than 30 years later, is the joy of reading came through. The love he had of those stories and the belief he had in those stories came through. It made me care about them. I mean, the one that he read that made me cry was Where the Red Fern Grows, which is a story about a boy and his dogs. And it's a beautiful story. And it's also like for a little girl, not necessarily an easy one to connect with, at least not for me. I'm like, it's about a boy and his dogs, and they're hunting raccoons, and I have no connection with that. And that makes me uncomfortable anyway. And but his love of the story and of sharing it did come across, and it made me want to continue to sit and listen. And it created this space, appreciate a story that wasn't there before. So I think that's a big part of it, is just finding what you know and love so that you can be able to connect that with other people. And you have a love of language. So I think it also makes sense that the stories that you gravitate to also allow you to luxuriate in that, and that joy and that love comes through as well. Yeah,
that's absolutely. I love the way you said about space, Megan, because I talk about that too in our crowded, busy world. To be able to have a bit of space for ourselves and for our children. And I think the pandemic brought that out too for a lot of people. It's just take a big breath and
We're coming up on our final segment, Kathleen. We do something called an educator spotlight. We'd love for you to join us with it, which basically means that we highlight what an excellent educator is doing in the world. And it's just everyday educators doing amazing things. So we'd love for you to, Susan will share a little bit about it, and we'll just kind of talk a few minutes about it. And then we'll end with helping people know how to find you. So we're going to transition quickly to this educator spotlight. Susan's going to, this
Spelling,
is a new platform for us.
New platform. And so I'm excited to share a story today of an educator who's a special education, special day class educator who started a coffee cart. I'm going to let her and her students tell about it, but it's a really interesting and just heartwarming and powerful story. And so I'm excited to share. I'm going to put you guys into our backstage.
My name is Sadie Guthrie, and I'm a special ed teacher at Lawton Alternative School. I think the advantage special ed teachers have is we get so close to the family and we work so hard with certain students every day that you can't not have an emotional relationship with these families and kids. Sometimes it's really difficult for special ed or school settings to be like, okay, go talk to this person. But if you don't have like a common ground, it's pretty difficult. And I think when I thought to bring Coffee Cart to Lawton, I just really thought there could be nothing better to like improve our community and give the kids in my class like more opportunity to become part of the greater school community.
My name's Vidad. My job at Coffee Cart to ask the teachers they want coffee.
My name's Jackie. I'm a barista.
What's your name?
Nathan. I'm the cashier. I think it's money. My name is David. I order coffee.
I think everyone was a little hesitant to start. They didn't really get the purpose, but once I kind of explained, we're learning job skills and independence and responsibility and all these functional skills, and we're being a part of the community, it kind of started to click. And then when we started doing it, it just rocketed. We go to Devil's Teeth, which is a local bakery, and we get a baked good donation. We're now out in the actual community, showing people really what we're capable of. Then we have to learn transportation skills, which are really important in big urban cities. We then have to take the transportation to get the baked goods, where we do kind of social interactions with strangers, safe strangers, obviously. So Coffee Cart's kind of cool because we're creating that community within our school, and it's mobile. So my students are getting out of the classroom. They're being seen as very productive, contributing members of our school.
Office.
Oh, you have my favorite scones. So I would like a scone to accompany my tea, please. Any school in this country could take this example to help transform their own school community, to make sure that every child feels accepted, that every child feels that they belong, that they have a place.
And that's just, again, it's such a powerful way of just helping people to get to know kids that often can be frightening or confusing to others because they're just different, right? But to be able to show that and support those connections and conversations feels so important, and also give the students a sense of ways to connect with others. This is a really beautiful story, and that's in San Francisco, it looked like anyway.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I mean, part of why I chose this story today for our educator spotlight was, I always love creativity and bringing real world experience into the classroom and into our communities. I think sometimes we get into these rigid ways of thinking about what is education, and that in my experience in education and also clinically, most of the growth and the sort of those moments where we rocket shoot the growth or the experience is when joy and being in the real world and sort of feeling that efficacy or feeling like some importance. And you could see in those kids' eyes how they felt so much pride in what they were doing, and they felt like they really had something important and responsible to do. And they were also learning math and transportation and some of their academic goals. So
that's wonderful. Yeah, we all need that sense of purpose. I think that's our little mission. We've all got the same mission, really, but bringing joy into the world. That was very beautiful. And talking at the end there, but we all want that sense of belonging. And look what happens when people feel as if they don't belong. It's, that sense of belonging is so important.
Yeah. Kathleen, this was just truly magical talking with you today. How can people find out more about you and follow you? What are all the locations?
Well, thank you. Well, first of all, we're on Instagram at Journey with Story. And really, my website is also kathleenpelley.com, Pelley. So we're on Instagram, my website. Love it if you'd sign up for Journey with Story, our podcast. We've got lots of subscribers, but we always love to have more. And we love to see you on Instagram. We've actually got a little giveaway right now on Instagram for my latest book. It's for little children, but it's called 5 Little Angels, but it's basically about little angels who look down on earth below, and whenever they see loving acts of kindness, they dance with joy, and one by one they tumble down to earth. But yet again, it's another book about kindness. I seem to gravitate to this whole notion of kindness. Gandhi said that, be the change in the world, and I always think, that's how you be the change, is with kindness. So
I agree. Kindness is the most important thing. And so I don't think there could be too many books about kindness. So I appreciate you having so many of them in the world. So incredibly grateful for your time today.
Thank you for letting me wax poetic about what I love. What a great way to spend an hour. Thank you.
It was beautiful. I could listen to you talk, and I will when I listen to your podcast.
I have to admit, there's some friends and some people that say to me, I do listen to your podcast, Kathleen, but I listen to it at night so I can go to sleep. Okay, whatever works.
That might be my new That might be my new routine. And I know some little ones that I will definitely tell about.
Good.
Your podcast, and also just the heart behind it, because I think it can't be so magical unless you have a truly loving heart as well, and that comes through. So I'm appreciative of what you're putting in the world.
It was lovely to meet you both. Thank you very much.
Lovely to meet you. And so also
Thank you, Kathleen. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Megan. Thank you, Susan.
Thank you.
Nice holiday weekend. Thank you.
Happy weekend.
Class is dismissed. Wasn't that fun? Susan and Megan are always happy to greet you on the next episode of The Awakening Educator. Connect with us on Facebook, Instagram, YouTube. Education is the foundation for a brighter future. Open your eyes to The Awakening Educator